I need to tell you something before I start. I have been a cadet observer for 6 cycles at the Galactic Integration Academy on Sector 9. I have watched species from 43 different star systems walk through those glass corridors, sit in those humming classrooms, and try to figure out what it means to exist alongside beings utterly unlike themselves. I have seen Trellian cadets cry from sensory overload on their first day. I have seen a quorum-bred warrior, and these are beings who survived the collapse wars. Mind you, sit down in the middle of the corridor and refuse to move for 11 hours because the cafeteria smell was unfamiliar. I have seen things that should have prepared me for anything. And then Cadet Marcus Vega walked in on a Tuesday morning, carrying a cracked thermos of something that smelled like scorched beans, wearing a jacket with a patch on the elbow that had been stitched back together at least 4 times. And he sat down in seat 7 of room 14C like he owned the entire planet. He did not know what was coming. Or maybe he did. That is the part that still keeps me awake. Let me set the scene properly, because if I just tell you what happened without explaining where we were and who was in that room, you will not understand the weight of it. Room 14C at the Galactic Integration Academy is not a classroom in any way you might picture if you are human. It is roughly the size of what humans call a football field, though the dimensions shift slightly depending on which species is enrolled in the session. The environmental control systems adjust temperature, atmospheric pressure, even gravity gradients in different zones to accommodate everyone. The ceiling is 50 feet high. The walls are transparent alloy, looking out over the central courtyard where 3 suns rise at different hours, so the light in room 14C is never quite the same color twice. The desks, if you can call them that, are arranged in a broad arc. Some cadets sit on surfaces, some float above them in suspension fields. One species, the Voth, exists primarily as electrical impulse and occupies a sealed containment column near the back that hums faintly at all times. We had 2 Voth in session 14. They smelled like ozone and old libraries. The course was called Interspecies Threat Psychology, which, I realize, is an extremely clinical name for what was essentially a class about fear. What makes different beings afraid? Why? And what happens physiologically and behaviorally when fear responses are triggered across species? Professor Aldon 6 taught the course. Aldon 6 was a Marathi, a species with 6 limbs, a bioluminescent collar that shifted color with their mood, and approximately 400 years of teaching experience. They were considered one of the foremost experts in galactic behavioral psychology. They had written the textbook. Literally, the standard interspecies behavioral psychology manual, used across 37 academies, was authored by Aldon 6. Their name was on the cover in 17 languages. They were brilliant. They were also, it turned out, deeply and catastrophically wrong about one specific thing. On that Tuesday morning, there were 31 cadets in room 14C. 29 of them were non-human. One was me, Iran 4, Velhari, Observer Track, 3rd cycle. And one was Marcus Vega. He was the first human admitted to the Integration Academy in 6 years. The last human cadet, a woman named Priya something, I never caught her full name, had left after 2 cycles for reasons that were never officially explained. Unofficially, I heard she found the constant species adjustment protocols exhausting. I heard other things too, less charitable, but I will not repeat those here because this is a story about Marcus, and it deserves to stay that way. He arrived 8 minutes before class started. Most cadets arrived at least 20 minutes early. The atmosphere adjustments took time, and some species needed to acclimate. Marcus walked in with his thermos, glanced around the room like he was checking for an empty seat at a diner, and settled into seat 7. Seat 7 was right in the center of the arc, the most visible position in the room. Nobody sat there by choice. The environmental field in that zone was calibrated for a median atmospheric mix, which meant it was slightly wrong for almost everyone. Most cadets picked the edge positions where the gradient was tuned specifically for their biology. Marcus sat in the middle, sipped from his cracked thermos, pulled out a beat-up paper notebook and uncapped a pen. A pen, an actual physical ink-based writing instrument. The Grell cadet sitting 2 seats to his left, a being with 4 eyes arranged vertically, and a nervous habit of clicking its secondary mandibles, stared at that pen for a full minute like it might be a weapon. I was sitting in the observer's alcove to the right of the arc, elevated slightly, with my notation tablet. My job that session was to record behavioral responses across species during the coursework exercises. Standard observer protocol. I wrote at the top of my page, human male, young, seat 7, seems unbothered. Then I crossed out seems and wrote appears. Then I crossed that out too and wrote is. I did not know why I was so certain, but I was. Professor Aldon 6 entered at exactly the designated hour. Their bioluminescent collar was a steady pale blue, professional, neutral composed. They moved to the front of the room with that particular gliding efficiency the Marathi have, all 6 limbs working in perfect coordination. "Good morning, cadets," they said, and the translation nodes built into every desk rendered it simultaneously in 31 languages. "Today we will be conducting a practical exercise." There was a murmur around the room. Practical exercises in Aldon 6's class had a reputation. They were not cruel, the professor would have found that concept baffling, but they were thorough. And thoroughness, when applied to fear, can feel like cruelty from the inside. Aldon 6 touched the central control panel and the room's light dimmed slightly. A display screen descended from the ceiling, the large kind, 20 feet across, used for whole-room demonstrations. "The subject of today's exercise," Aldon 6 said, "is the trigger-response mapping of auditory fear stimuli across species. Specifically, we will be exploring how different biological systems process sounds that have been evolutionarily categorized as predator warnings or lethal threat indicators." They paused, looked around the room. Their collar flickered briefly to a warm amber, the Marathi equivalent of anticipatory interest. The Academy's Xenobiology Division has spent 14 cycles compiling what we believe to be a comprehensive database of the most physiologically effective threat sound frequencies for every enrolled species. These sounds have been selected based on deep evolutionary data, what your species' ancestors feared, what is encoded in your biology as danger. More murmuring. The grell to Marcus's left clicked its mandibles faster. A pair of Shorin cadets, fluid, iridescent beings who communicated partly through color shifts, had gone a deep, uneasy purple. "We will play these sounds," Aldon 6 continued, in sequence. "The response data will be collected non-invasively through the room's biosensor network. You will then have the opportunity to observe and discuss your own and your peers' physiological reactions. This is not a test of willpower or bravery. It is data collection. You are not expected to be unaffected. You are expected to be honest." A Pelari cadet near the back, massive, rocky-skinned, usually impassive, shifted in its seat. That was notable. Pelari cadets very rarely shifted. I noted it down. And then I looked at Marcus Vega. He had his pen hovering over his notebook. He was looking at the screen with an expression I struggled to categorize. Not fear, not bravado, something quieter. Curiosity, maybe. Or recognition. Aldon 6 began with the lower threat tier, sounds that registered strongly, but were not intended to cause acute distress. The first sound played was a low subsonic rumble, something that registered more in the chest than the ears. The Kalari cadets, 3 of them insectoid, colonial-minded, all simultaneously pressed their bodies flat against their desk surfaces. Pure reflex. They looked embarrassed afterward. The second sound was a sharp clicking sequence at 4,000 hertz, the territorial warning of a predator from the Shorin home system, apparently. Both Shorin cadets went completely white. One of them made a sound like wind through a hollow pipe, which I later learned was an involuntary alarm vocalization. They apologized afterward. The other cadets reassured them. It was fine. That was the point. The third sound was something I cannot even fully describe. It existed partly outside ranges I can perceive. The Voth in their containment column flared visibly. Massive arcs of blue-white electricity crackled through the column walls. It lasted only a second or two before they regulated, but the room smelled strongly of ozone for several minutes after. Each sound was followed by a pause. Aldon 6 would speak briefly about what the sound was, why it registered as it did, what evolutionary context produced that response. The cadets who had reacted would share their subjective experience when they were comfortable. It was careful, respectful, educational. Marcus took notes through all of it. I watched him, his pen moved steadily. He tilted his head slightly when the subsonic rumble played, the way you might when you hear something from the next room and you are not sure what it is. When the clicking sequence played, he tapped his pen against his notebook twice. When the Voth flared, he leaned forward a little, looking interested. Not alarmed. Interested. Then Aldon 6 cleared her throat, a sound the Marathi make deliberately to signal a transition. We have now reached what the database classifies as Tier 3, she said. These are high-intensity threat sounds, sounds which, according to our evolutionary research, register as acute danger signals in the deep biological layers of each species' neural architecture. The brain stem level, you might say, below conscious thought. She looked around the room. I want to emphasize again, these are not meant to cause harm. The biosensors will alert me if any cadet's stress indicators approach concerning levels, and I will pause the sequence. You may opt out by raising your flag indicator on your desk. There is no judgment in that choice. Nobody raised their flag. Aldon 6 nodded, touched the control panel. We will begin the Tier 3 sequence. The first sound in this tier belongs specifically to our human cadet. She glanced briefly at Marcus, not unkindly, just noting him. Cadet Vega, you are the only human in this session. The evolutionary threat data compiled for Homo sapiens represents some of the most complex fear trigger mapping in our database. Humans are, as the xenobiology team noted in their findings, a species with an unusually rich predator-to-prey and prey-to-predator historical experience. She said that last part like it was a scientific observation, which it was. She was not wrong. She was just, as I said, catastrophically wrong about what came next. The sound began. I will try to describe it, though I am not sure I have the words. It started low. A deep, resonant vocalization that was something like a growl but larger than a growl, a sound with real physical mass to it, something that seemed to press against the chest and the gut simultaneously. And then it shifted, layered, added harmonics that the xenobiology team had identified as the most acute fear triggers in human auditory evolutionary history. What I later learned, reading the database notes, the sound had been synthesized from recordings of large felid predators, canid apex hunters, and a specific infrasound frequency associated with massive prehistoric reptilian megafauna, animals that humans' ancient ancestors had genuinely feared, the ones that shaped human fear responses at the deepest biological level. The xenobiology team had done their research. The sound was technically, objectively, a masterwork of evolutionary threat acoustics. The room went very still. I could see it working on the non-human cadets who had some exposure to Earth biology. The grell clicked its mandibles in distress. The sound apparently triggered cross-species threat responses in beings who shared certain neural architecture with humans. Two cadets near the back actually moved physically away from the speakers, sliding their desk surfaces toward the walls. The Pelari cadet made a sound like grinding stone that I had never heard from a Pelari before. And I watched Marcus Vega. He went still, for just a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3. His pen stopped. I thought, there it is. And then something happened that I had not seen in 6 cycles of observing cadets. He smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not the tight, controlled expression of someone fighting a fear response down. Not bravado. Something genuine and private, the way you smile when you see something you recognize from a long time ago, something that carries a particular kind of memory. He tilted his head. He looked at the speaker array on the far wall. And I could see him listening, really listening. The sound played for 12 seconds. It was designed to simulate an encounter, the approach, the presence, the proximity of something that had historically represented death to the human body's ancient memory. Marcus Vega leaned back in his seat. He sipped from his cracked thermos, and then very quietly he said something. The room was still relatively loud with the sound playing and the ambient reactions of 30-odd cadets around him, so the words did not carry. But I was close enough, and the observer alcove had directional audio enhancement. I heard him say it. I know that sound. When the sound ended, Aldon 6 let the silence sit for a moment. Standard protocol, give the nervous systems time to begin recalibrating. Cadet Vega, the professor said gently. The blue of her collar had softened to something more careful. Your biosensor readings are, a pause, somewhat unusual. Can you describe your subjective response? Marcus looked up from his notebook. He had gone back to writing during the last few seconds of the sound. He put his pen down, and he looked at the professor with an expression I can only describe as thoughtful. The felid component, he said, was mostly right. The deep chest thing, that part lands a little, yeah. He tapped his sternum once lightly. The high harmonics were good, technically impressive. He glanced at the speaker array again. The infrasound layer was accurate for the paleo-evolutionary data. Old stuff. Real old. Aldon 6's collar shifted to a color I had not seen before, sort of between violet and silver. I did not know what that meant. You were not alarmed, she said. It was a statement, not a question. I recognized it, Marcus said, like that explained everything. You recognized it, she repeated. Yeah, he picked his pen back up. We have things like that at home, not exactly that, but close enough. He almost smiled again. My neighbor's got a dog, big one, German Shepherd mix. He does this thing at night sometimes when he hears something in the woods at the back of the property, this sound that starts low and just. He trailed off, made a gesture with his hand that somehow communicated an escalating, rolling, intensifying noise. And there are cats in those woods too, bobcats mostly out where I'm from. You hear them at night, especially in late summer, and he shook his head slightly. It's recognizable is what I'm saying. Aldon 6 was quiet for a long moment. The Grell cadet was staring at Marcus. I was staring at Marcus. Cadet Vega, the professor said, you understand that what we just played was a synthesized composite of what xenobiology determined to be the most effective auditory fear triggers for your species' deep evolutionary memory. These are not current threats. These are. I know, Marcus said. I understand what it is. He paused, set his pen down again. But we hear things like that at home, most of us do. Not exactly that, but the category of it. And I know what it means. I know what those animals are and what they do and how to respond to them. He looked at the professor steadily. It's kind of hard to be scared of something you grew up next to. The room was very quiet. I wrote in my notation tablet, human response, recognition without acute fear, reason given, familiarity, biosensor data presumably anomalous, note for follow-up analysis. Aldon 6 took a breath. Her collar settled back to blue. She was not flustered. She had 47 years of teaching experience on top of the 4 centuries of study, and flustered was not a mode she operated in easily. But there was something recalibrating in her expression, something careful happening behind her eyes. Let us continue the sequence, she said. The next sound in the Tier 3 database was not for Marcus. It was for the Pelari cadet, a sequence of high-frequency vibrations that resonated with something in the Pelari biological structure, apparently echoing the underground tunneling sounds of a massive burrowing predator from their home system. The Pelari cadet, and again, these are beings made mostly of what looks like layered rock and mineral lattice, actually stood up, reflexively. Just rose from its seat like its body made the decision before its mind caught up. 4 heavy feet planted, all secondary defensive plates spreading open like a flower made of granite. It sat back down after a moment, clearly embarrassed. The other cadets were respectful about it. Then Aldon 6 played the next sound in the human tier. I had not realized there were multiple entries. The xenobiology database, apparently, had been thorough. This one was different, higher, more layered. It was the sound of a specific kind of distress, prey animal distress, according to the notes I later accessed. The human evolutionary system was apparently highly responsive not just to predator sounds, but to the sounds of prey in distress because that sound historically meant a predator was close. It was a warning by proxy. Hear something else dying nearby and your body understood. Something is here. And mixed into this second sound was something else, a clicking, rhythmic. The sound, I read this later in the xenobiology notes, of a specific insect species from Earth, one associated in the human biological memory with nighttime, darkness, and the particular vulnerable silence between day and night. The sound was very carefully constructed. I looked at Marcus. This time his pen had stopped before the sound even fully developed. He set it down deliberately. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling, not anxious, just listening, really listening. His jaw moved slightly. He was breathing carefully, consciously. 14 seconds. The sound played for 14 seconds. And when it stopped, Marcus picked his pen back up, and there was a quality to his expression that was harder to name. Not fear, not exactly, something older. Aldon 6 looked at him. Cadet Vega, Biosensor readings indicate a different response profile to this iteration. Yeah, Marcus said quietly. Can you describe? That one's more, he stopped, considered his words. That one's more complicated, he looked at the professor. The first one was something I know. I've heard versions of that in the woods and in the fields, and I know what to do about it. But that second one, he paused again. That's the one we hear and we don't see anything. That's the one that means something's there but you don't know where. He set his pen on the notebook. The crickets at night. You hear them and then they stop, and the stopping is the warning. The silence is the sound. He looked at the professor. That one I understand differently. Differently, Aldon 6 said. It makes me more careful, Marcus said. Not scared, careful. There was a break built into the session halfway through the Tier 3 sequence. Standard protocol, 15 minutes for physiological recalibration, water atmospheric adjustment. The biosensor network flagged several cadets as needing the break more than protocol timing suggested, and Aldon 6 called it a few minutes early. I stayed in my observer alcove. I usually did during breaks, gave me a chance to compile notes without being in the social flow of the room. Marcus Vega stayed in his seat. After a moment, the Grell cadet, the one who had been sitting 2 seats to his left, the one with the 4 vertical eyes and the mandible clicking, slid its desk surface a few feet closer to him. It was a social gesture for the Grell. Moving toward someone during a break period meant deliberate approach. Marcus noticed, he glanced over. You're the human, the Grell said. Its translation node gave its voice a slightly mechanical quality, but the curiosity in the words was genuine. Marcus, he said. I am Sarathven, 3rd cycle. The Grell clicked its mandibles twice, which I knew was a Grell greeting gesture. You were not afraid. Marcus thought about that for a moment. I was a little, he said. Second sound got into me a bit, that's honest. Sarathven processed this, but you did not show it the way the others showed it. I knew what it was, Marcus said again. Knowing what a thing is makes it different from just feeling it without understanding it. Sarathven was quiet. Then, where you come from, you have predators like those sounds. Yeah. Large ones. Some large, some not so large. Size isn't always the relevant factor. Marcus sipped his thermos. We've got spiders that can kill you in under a minute. We've got plants that will do it slower. We've got animals the size of your desk that are mostly harmless, and animals the size of your hand that will end your afternoon. Sarathven clicked its mandibles in what I knew was rapid-fire agitation. Your planet sounds problematic. It's home, Marcus said, simply no particular emphasis, just it's home. Sarathven considered this. You grew up there. With these things. My family's had the same property for 4 generations, Marcus said. We back up against the Appalachian Range. There are things in those woods that have been there longer than the property, longer than the family, longer than any of the names we've given anything. He looked at the window, at the 3-sun light cutting through the transparent alloy. You learn to know them, what they sound like, what they mean when they make that sound versus a different sound. What direction the sound came from and what that means about where the thing is and what it's doing. He paused. You learn, and once you've learned, it's not the same as being ignorant of it. Ignorance makes fear stronger, Sarathven said. Yeah, Marcus said. Usually. I wrote in my tablet, break period. Cadet Vega engaged in voluntary interspecies dialogue. Communication style, direct, experiential, grounded in personal history. Interesting. The second half of the session was where the day became something I will remember for the rest of my cycles. Aldon 6 reconvened the class, and the sequence resumed. There were 7 more sounds in the human evolutionary database. The xenobiology team had been comprehensive, as I said. The third human-specific sound was a particular register of human vocalization, specifically, the sound of a human child crying in distress. I will be clear about this. I understand the science of why this was included. The sound of an infant or young offspring in danger is one of the most acute biological alarm triggers in any species that practices parental care. It bypasses rational thought. It hits somewhere preconscious and old. Aldon 6 announced what the sound was before playing it, which was standard protocol for this category. Voluntary reflexive response sounds, warning of content. Marcus put his pen down. His expression changed in a way I would call bracing, not dramatic, just a subtle setting of the jaw, a particular stillness. The sound played. It was brief, 6 seconds, and Marcus sat through it with his hands flat on his notebook and his eyes forward and his jaw set. And when it ended, he exhaled through his nose, controlled, and picked his pen back up. Cadet Vega, Aldon 6 said softly. I'm good, he said. The biosensor. I know what it says, he said. I'm good. He was not entirely good, I think, but he was functional, and he wanted to be noted as functional, so I noted that. Aldon 6 moved on. The fourth, fifth, and sixth sounds in the human database were, according to the synthesizer notes, composites of environmental cues associated with imminent structural danger, social isolation signals, and what the xenobiology team clinically labeled consequence of failure to defend. I will not detail all of them. What I will say is that by the fourth sound, something had shifted in the room. The other cadets had stopped monitoring their own responses and started watching Marcus. It was not unkind. It was more like witnessing. They were beginning to understand something. I could see it in how they held themselves, how their attention had oriented. The Shorin cadets had shifted from deep purple to something quieter and more thoughtful. The Pelari cadet, still slightly embarrassed about its own Tier 3 response, had its secondary plates folded down, which in Pelari body language meant it was paying close, respectful attention. Because Marcus had not broken. He had responded. Genuinely, honestly, the biosensors were recording real physiological reactions, but he had not broken. And the way he was sitting with those reactions, acknowledging them without being dismantled by them, was something that the room was absorbing and processing. After the sixth sound, Sarath Ven the Grill asked, "How do you do that?" Marcus looked over. Do what? Experience it and stay here. Sarath Ven made a gesture with one of its secondary limbs. Still here, still in the seat, still writing. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You know those things are real, he said. The things the sounds represent, the things that can hurt you, you know they're real, and you know that knowing about them hasn't protected you from feeling it when it comes. He tapped his pen against the notebook. But you're still here, right, every time. The thing happened, or the version of it happened, or you heard the sound, and you're still sitting in the seat. At some point you start to notice that you're still here. The room was very quiet. You build a record, Marcus said, of still being here, and you trust the record. I did not write anything for a while after that. I just sat with it. Then came the seventh sound. I will tell you about the seventh sound, because it is the one that changed the day from interesting to something I cannot fully categorize even now, weeks later, when I sit down to write this record. Aldon 6 announced it with a slightly different phrasing than the others. This final entry in the evolutionary database is unusual, she said. The xenobiology team flagged it specifically. It represents what they termed an anomalous evolutionary category for the human species. She paused. What makes it anomalous is this. Of all the sounds in the human evolutionary threat database, this one produced the highest across-the-board stress response in laboratory analysis. The highest spike, the strongest physiological reaction, and it is not a predator sound. The room was quiet. It is, Aldon 6 said, the sound of human voices, specifically a large crowd of human voices in a state of unified, elevated distress. What the xenobiology team categorized as, she consulted her notes, a riot or panic stampede condition. Many humans in proximity in acute fear or rage. The sound of your own kind in large number distress. She looked at Marcus. This registered higher than the apex predator composite, higher than the child vocalization. The xenobiology team hypothesized it is because this sound, evolutionarily, represented a threat so large that even the humans who encountered it had already lost control of the situation. When you hear your own species in mass distress, the implication encoded in your biology is, there is no defense ready. She was quiet for a moment. Cadet Vega, I want to be clear. You may absolutely flag out of this final sound. The data we already have is. Play it, Marcus said. Flat, simple, not aggressive, just play it. Aldon 6 looked at him for a long moment. Her collar went to that violet-silver color again. Then she touched the panel. The sound filled the room. And I will tell you honestly, it affected me. I am Velhari. My evolutionary history is nothing like a human's. My species does not have that specific deep brain coding for crowd distress. And it still got into something in me that I do not have a name for in my own language. because there is something about the particular frequency of many beings in panic that goes beyond species, something in the sheer collective weight of it. The Shorin cadets went white. The Pelari cadets' plates spread wide. The Grell Serathven made a sustained low sound I had never heard before and later learned was a Grell fear vocalization that most Grells spend their adult lives never making. And Marcus Vega sat forward. Not back forward. He put his elbows on the desk and he leaned toward the sound, and his expression was not calm exactly, but focused. The way a doctor's expression goes focused when there is an emergency and they are the only one present. The way a person's expression goes focused when they recognize their moment. The sound played for 20 seconds. It was the longest of the sequence. When it stopped, the room needed time. Aldan 6 let the silence sit, longer than usual. Then she said very carefully, "Cadet Vega." Marcus sat back. He looked at the professor. His jaw was set in that bracing way again, but something else was there too, something harder and older. "That one," he said, "I know in a different way." "Can you tell me?" "It's the sound that means everyone who was supposed to have a plan doesn't have one anymore." He looked at his hands for a moment. "It means you're on your own and there's no waiting for someone else to fix it." He paused. "I grew up watching footage of that sound, news footage, history footage, we all did. You learn early that that sound is the one where the normal rules stop." He looked at the professor. "It doesn't make me afraid, it makes me," he searched for the word, "ready in a specific way, like a switch." "You respond with increased action orientation," Aldan 6 said, and there was something in her voice I had not heard before. "Yeah," Marcus said, "something like that." The room was quiet. "Your species," Aldan 6 said, slowly, "encodes that particular sound as a call to function rather than as a threat to escape." "Some of us do," Marcus said, "not all of us." "But some." The break after the sequence was longer than protocol required. Aldan 6 gave us 25 minutes instead of 15, and she spent those 25 minutes at her control panel with her back to the room, working through something on her tablet that I suspect was the notes she was already making for the research paper she would eventually publish. I climbed down from the observer's alcove and walked over to seat 7. I had not done that before during a session. Observers are supposed to stay in the alcove during active coursework, but the sequence was over and technically we were in break period. Marcus Vega was refilling his thermos from a larger container he had apparently stashed in the bag under his desk. The scorched bean smell was stronger up close. "That's coffee?" I asked. He looked up. "Yeah, you know coffee." "I have read about it. I have not." I made the Velhari gesture for experienced personally. "Is it good?" He looked at the thermos with an expression that was fond and slightly skeptical simultaneously. "It's hot," he said, "and it helps." He paused. "Good is complicated." I sat down in the seat next to him. "I am Iran 4, observer track." "Marcus," he offered his hand, and I took it, the way humans do. "I wanted to ask," I said, "about the last sound, the crowd sound." He nodded. "You leaned toward it," I said. "The other cadets moved away, you moved toward it." He thought about this for a long moment. "I don't know if I can explain it in a way that translates," he said finally, "but there's a thing on Earth. An old idea that if something is loud enough and bad enough and there are enough people in the middle of it, someone has to go in the direction the sound is coming from." He looked at his thermos. "Because the people in there are people, and they're in the middle of it and someone has to know that matters." He shrugged, a small motion. "You train toward the thing, not away from it. Otherwise, you're just waiting for the sound to find you." "You are trained," I said, "specifically for that response." "Not officially," he said, "but yeah." "By what?" He thought about it. "Living on Earth," he said, "for long enough paying attention." I wrote in my tablet, much later when I was back in my quarters. "The human does not experience fear the way we expected. He has not eliminated it. He has changed his relationship to it. This appears to be a species-wide adaptation, or possibly a subset adaptation, to an environment that produces fear stimuli at an unusually high rate and intensity. Further study warranted. Significant further study." The last 20 minutes of the session were discussion-based. Aldan 6 brought the class back together and asked cadets to share, voluntarily, what they had noticed about their own responses during the sequence. It was good discussion, thoughtful, The Kalari cadets spoke about how the subsonic frequency had bypassed their conscious processing entirely. They had not decided to flatten against their desks, their bodies had simply done it. A Shorin cadet spoke about how the Shorin fear response involved color shift partly as a signaling mechanism for the collective. One Shorin's fear was broadcast to others, so the group could respond together, which meant in the room it had created a feedback loop between the two Shorin cadets that accelerated both their responses. The Pelari cadet, with great dignity, acknowledged that its involuntary standing had surprised it, and that it was considering what that meant about the deep persistence of evolutionary encoding, even in a being who was 400 years old and had fought in 3 of the Pelari Wars. It was the kind of conversation that reminded me why I was in the observer track. This was the work that mattered, understanding each other's deepest biology. Not assuming the surface of a being told you what the layers underneath were doing. When it came to Marcus, Aldon 6 asked him what he wanted to share. He thought about it for a moment. "I'll say this," he said to the room, the whole room, the arc of 30 species, all those eyes and optical sensors and photoreceptors turned toward him. What the xenobiology team put together was accurate, technically, scientifically accurate. Those sounds hit real things in my evolutionary wiring. I'm not pretending they didn't. He paused. But there's a difference between something hitting you and something stopping you. And for most of us on Earth, not all, but most, a lot of the things in that database are things we grew up alongside. We know what they are. We have names for them. We have maps of the places where you hear them and what to do when you do. He looked around at the cadets. That doesn't make you braver than your biology. It makes you educated about your biology, and there's a big difference. He picked up his pen. I think you can know a thing that scares you well enough that it starts to clarify rather than paralyze. You know where the edges of it are. You know what it can and can't do. And then it's still scary, but it's scary in a useful direction. Aldon 6 was quiet for a long moment after that. Her collar had gone to a color I had to look up afterward. In Marathi, it is a color associated with recalibrating a significant assumption. It is, apparently, a relatively rare collar state. Most Marathi teachers go their entire careers without it appearing more than a handful of times. "Cadet Vega," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand it is a genuine inquiry, not a challenge." "Sure," he said. "The xenobiology database," she said, "was built on the assumption that evolutionary threat sounds would be universally disorienting for the species they targeted, that the deep biological encoding would override, to some degree, acclimated response." She paused. "We were not wrong about the biology. The biosensors confirmed the responses were real. But she paused again longer. "We did not account for the possibility that a species might simultaneously have those biological responses encoded and have culturally transmitted, experientially reinforced tools for functioning within those responses." Marcus nodded slowly. "That is not in the database," Aldon 6 said. "The tools, the learned frameworks, the relationship to the fear rather than the fear itself." "I know," Marcus said. "How many of your species have that?" she asked. He thought about it, honestly, carefully, the way he seemed to do everything. "A lot of us," he said. "In different ways, in different relationships. Not the same tool for everyone, it comes from different places in different people. Some from their families, some from their communities, some from what they've been through personally, some from what they've studied or trained or believed." He paused. "But the general idea that the sound isn't the same as the thing, and knowing the thing changes your relationship to the sound, I think that's pretty widely distributed." Aldon 6 nodded slowly. "I will be revising the database notes." "I'll help if it's useful," Marcus said. "I've got time." That got a sound from Sarath Ven, a clicking that went fast and then softened, the Grell version of something like appreciation. Class ended at the designated time. Cadets dispersed, and the room began its environmental adjustment cycles for the next session. The lights shifted back toward full spectrum. The temperature gradients recalibrated. I stayed to finish my observation notes. Marcus was the last non-staff person in the room. He was packing his notebook and his pen and his thermos into his bag, taking his time with it. The kind of person who doesn't rush the endings of things. He stopped on his way to the door, looked at the speaker array on the far wall, the one that had produced all 7 sounds from the sequence. He looked at it for a few seconds. Then he said, mostly to himself, in a quiet voice that I caught only because the room had gone still, and the observer alcove's audio was still running. "You should come visit sometime. I'll introduce you to the woods." He went out the door. I sat in the alcove for a long time after that, looking at my notes. I had filled 6 pages. Usually I fill 1, maybe 2, for a standard session. I read back through them, and I underlined one thing I had written during the break period, the thing Marcus had said to Serath Ven. "You build a record of still being here, and you trust the record." I do not know exactly why that line stayed with me the way it did, but I suspect it will stay with me for a long time. Maybe it is because I am Velhari, and the Velhari have a long tradition of keeping exactly that kind of record. The record of continuity. The evidence that the difficult things were survived. Maybe it is because I had been sitting in that room watching 31 different kinds of beings confront the things their deepest biology recognized as dangerous, and I had expected the human to be the one who needed the most support, and instead he had been the one who sat forward when the worst sound played. Maybe it is because of what he said afterward, that the sound wasn't the same as the thing, that knowing the thing changed your relationship to the sound. I have been thinking about that ever since. I have been thinking about all the sounds I avoid, all the frequencies I do not let myself hear because I have categorized them without fully understanding them. All the things I have organized as threat without ever sitting in seat 7 in the middle of the room and learning what they actually are. Marcus Vega had a cracked thermos and a notebook with ink-based writing and a jacket with stitched elbows. He came from a planet that is genuinely, measurably, not metaphorically full of things that can kill you. He had a neighbor's dog that sounded like the darkness and forests that sounded like history and news footage that had taught him, from childhood, what a civilization's worst moments sound like from the outside. And he sat in seat 7, and he took notes. And when the sound of mass human panic played, the thing the xenobiology database said was the most effective fear trigger for his species, he leaned forward. I keep thinking about that. About what it takes to build a relationship to the things that are supposed to stop you. About what kind of planet, what kind of life, what kind of accumulated small mornings with cracked thermoses and stitched elbows and 4th-generation properties backing up against old mountains produces a being who leans toward the sound. I think Earth is doing something to humans that we have not fully accounted for. I think the xenobiology database needs a new section. I think I want to take that class again next cycle, just to see what else I missed. Later that evening, I was in the common corridor near the Section B residential pods when I heard Marcus Vega's voice coming from around a corner. He was on a communication link. The small personal kind, handheld, that humans use. He was talking to someone at home. I could tell from the casual ease of it, the way the register of his voice dropped into something warmer and less careful. I did not mean to hear, I was passing. But I heard a few sentences. Yeah, it was fine. They did this fear sound thing, playing predator recordings at different species to map the reactions. A pause. He must have been listening to whoever was on the other end. No, I was fine. They played the big cat composite and I just... He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Yeah, I know. I told them about the woods. Another pause. How's the dog? A pause. Good, tell him I said hi. Another pause. And Mom, tell me it rained. I just need to hear it rained. A long pause. Good, he said softly. Good, that's good. I walked past and did not look back, and I pretended I had not heard any of it. But I wrote it down later. Because it seemed important. Because a being who could sit through 7 evolutionary fear triggers in a row and come out the other side taking notes and leaning forward, that same being, hours later, just wanted to hear that it had rained on the property. That the old mountains were still getting their weather. That the dog was fine. You build a record of still being here. And you trust the record. Observation log entry, Iran 4, Velhari Collective, Observer Track, Cycle 6, Session 14, Room 14C, Galactic Integration Academy, Sector 9. Subject, Cadet Marcus Vega, Human Earth Origin. Summary, the Academy's evolutionary fear database is technically correct and practically incomplete. It accurately maps what triggers the fear response in humans. It does not account for what humans do with that response, or why, or what 4 billion years of a particularly violent and beautiful planet does to a species in terms of its relationship to the things that could end it. The human did not fail to be afraid. He was afraid, and he was present, and he was already thinking about what to do next. I am recommending a full curriculum review of the human psychophysiology module. I am also recommending we add a section on what the database calls anomalous evolutionary categories, the sounds that trigger not escape, but engagement. I am also going to try coffee. The scorch bean kind. End of entry. End of Part 1. Part 2, the week they decided to push further. Word travels fast in an academy of 37 species. By the next morning, the story had gotten out. I do not know exactly how. The official session recordings were restricted to academic staff and the enrolled cadets. But 31 people had been in that room, and 31 people had dormitory neighbors, dining companions, corridor acquaintances, communication links. Information spreads through social networks the way water spreads through porous stone, not always through any single visible channel, but inexorably finding every crack. By the time I arrived at the Observer briefing the morning after Session 14, 3 different cadets from other cohorts had already asked me about the human. By the time Marcus Vega walked into the cafeteria for his first meal of the day, carrying his thermos and his notebook as though they were biological extensions of his hands, there was already a quality to the room's attention when he entered. Not hostile, not worshipful, more like recalibration in real time. The kind of attention a room gives to something that has disrupted its assumptions. He found a table near the eastern window wall where the first of the 3 suns had just risen and the light was long and amber and specific. He sat down. He opened his notebook. 2 Shoran cadets approached after a few minutes and asked if they could sit with him. He said yes. By the end of the meal, there were 7 other cadets at that table. Marcus ate what appeared to be an earth food. The cafeteria had printed it based on a nutrient profile he had submitted. And he answered questions, and he asked his own questions, and he looked at the long amber light on the window wall, sometimes in the way that people look at a color that reminds them of somewhere else. I ate at the Observer table, and I watched and I wrote. Day 2, social integration proceeding organically. The session appears to have functioned as a trust-building event rather than, as the psychological theory would predict, an isolating one. Possible explanation. The cadets witnessed the human being genuinely affected, genuinely honest about being affected, and genuinely functional despite it. This combination appears to be producing a specific kind of trust. What I did not know at the time of that breakfast was that a different process was underway in a different part of the academy. There was a group. I will not call them what some of the later reports called them, because I think that framing was too simple and too clean. They were not villains in any classic sense. They were a collection of cadets, 7 of them from 4 different species, who had a particular view of the place humans should occupy in the galactic community, which was a lower place than currently proposed. The Galactic Integration Academy was new, relatively speaking. The idea of bringing younger species, spacefaring but not yet council member species, into a shared educational environment with more established civilizations was contentious. Humans were the newest. They had been spacefaring in a meaningful way for less than 60 years. They had been in contact with galactic civilizations for 43 of those years. They were, in galactic terms, children. Very loud, very energetic, somewhat unpredictable children, from a planet that had, from the outside, always looked slightly like a difficult case. Some beings at the Academy thought the human should be studying fundamental xenosociology and remedial interspecies protocol, not sitting in Tier 3 fear psychology courses alongside species who had been navigating the galaxy for centuries. These beings had watched the recording of Session 14 from their dormitory connections. I said the official recording was restricted, but there are always unofficial routes, and they had not come away with the same feeling the other cadets in the room had come away with. They had come away with a specific kind of frustration. He was not supposed to sit through that the way he sat through it. And they decided they wanted to test it more directly. The challenge came on the 4th day. It was not announced. It was not sanctioned by the Academy in any way. What it was, officially, was a study group meeting in one of the open common rooms, the large multi-purpose spaces between the residential and academic wings that any cadet could book for any stated educational purpose. The purpose listed in the booking system was Comparative Threat Psychology Practicum. which was technically a real academic category, technically. Marcus received an invitation through the Academy's General Communication Network. Standard format, student to student. Join our study group for comparative threat psychology. We're hosting a practicum session. Your experience in session 14 seems relevant. He showed up. I found out about it from Sarath Ven, who found out about it from a Grell network that I will not claim to fully understand, and I went to the common room as an observer, which was within my rights, technically, since it was a stated educational event in a shared space. I arrived about 3 minutes after Marcus did. Common Room 7 was large, comfortable by Academy standards, the furniture adjusted to species, the lighting was full spectrum, and there was a small environmental control panel that cadets could use within preset parameters. It was usually used for genuine study groups, collaborative projects, interspecies cultural exchange sessions. There were 7 cadets already in the room, 4 different species. The leader, in the sense of being the one who did most of the talking, was a being named Vorathdal, a Kethani, tall, bilaterally symmetrical in a way that was superficially somewhat similar to human body plan, but with a secondary neural node visible at the base of the skull and a bioluminescent stripe down each arm that signaled mood state. Old species, proud species, a civilization that had been in the Galactic Council for over 1,000 years. Vorathdal looked at Marcus when he entered with an expression I recognized as evaluative. The kind of look someone gives when they are collecting data for a purpose they have already decided on. Marcus looked around the room, saw who was there, made some small internal calculation that showed briefly in his eyes, and sat down. "Thanks for coming," Vorathdal said. "Sure," Marcus said. He had his notebook. He did not have his thermos for once, I noted that. "We were interested in the session 14 discussion," Vorathdal said, "specifically in your responses to the fear sequence." "Okay," Marcus said. "We thought it might be productive to continue that exploration in a less formal setting." Vorathdal's arm stripes were a particular orange-gold color. I looked it up later. It was associated with controlled superiority in Kethani social signaling, with a more challenging stimulus set. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What kind of stimulus set?" "We've compiled some additional sounds," Vorathdal said, "from outside the Academy's official database, more specific. More targeted." The orange gold deepened slightly. "We wanted to see if your session 14 performance was representative or if it was contextual." There it was. Performance was the word that mattered there. The framing that what Marcus had done in session 14 was a kind of display, something he had managed because the setting was controlled and the sounds were academic, and that real conditions, harder conditions, might show something different. I was sitting near the door. I had my tablet out. I was watching Marcus. He looked at Vorathdal for a moment. "Can I ask what the sounds are first?" he said. "They're from your evolutionary database," Vorathdal said. "Extended set. Things the xenobiology team didn't use in the official session." "Things they chose not to use," Marcus said. "A beat." "Yes," Vorathdal said. "Why did they choose not to use them?" Marcus asked. "Caution," one of the other cadets said. "A preth, a species I was less familiar with, mostly because preth cadets tended to keep to themselves. This one had its secondary limbs folded tightly, which in preth body language I believed indicated something like excitement." "Caution," Marcus repeated. He looked around the room. "And you're doing it here in an unofficial setting without biosensors, without a trained professor present." There was a short silence. "We are cadets in an academic institution," Vorathdal said. "This is a study session." "Right," Marcus said, not agreeing. "Just noting." He looked at the room. He looked at the environmental control panel on the wall. He looked at the door where I was sitting, though I had the feeling he had already registered my presence and filed it somewhere. Then he said, "What specifically are you planning to play?" Vorathdal listed 3 sounds. I will describe them in the terms used. The first was what the extended xenobiology database listed as Tier 4, a composite specifically designed around what human neurological research identified as the most effective combination of temporal unpredictability and biological threat. In simple terms, it was a sound that came and went in arrhythmic patterns, never regular, never predictable, combined with frequencies that human physiology associated with proximity of a lethal threat. The unpredictability was the key variable. Humans, apparently, handle threat better when they can pattern it. Remove the pattern and the stress response intensifies significantly. The second was something outside the xenobiology database entirely. One of the 7 cadets present had connections to a xenostress research institution elsewhere in the sector, and had obtained a recording described as subthreshold aversion frequency for humans, a sound that does not register consciously at normal volumes, but produces documented increases in cortisol, heart rate irregularity, and hypervigilance when played at specific amplitudes. Below the threshold of conscious hearing, above the threshold of physiological effect. The third was something different. The third was not a predator sound or an evolutionary trigger or a neurological frequency. The third was a recording, actual audio from Earth, from a specific event, an event I had to look up later because I did not recognize the date Vorathdal gave. It was the audio recording of an event in human history that involved a very large number of human deaths in a concentrated period. A war event, specific, documented, the sounds of it. And the Kethani's arm stripes were still that orange gold as he described it. That, I thought, watching Vorathdal explain the third sound with clinical precision, is the line. I stood up from my observer position near the door. Everyone in the room looked at me. "I am stopping this practicum," I said. There was a silence. "You are an observer," Vorathdal said. "You have no authority to stop a study session." "I am stopping it anyway," I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not have to. The first 2 sounds are aggressive and unkind and outside the appropriate educational context, but I will note them and leave them for academic review. The third, I paused. The third is something different. The third is not a fear trigger. The third is a weapon, and you know that, which is why it is third. Vorathdal said nothing. Historical audio of a mass casualty event played without consent, without clinical framework, without the person's knowledge of what they are hearing, I said. To a single cadet from that species alone in an unsupervised room. That is not a study session. That is something else, and I want to be very clear that I am noting what it is. The room was silent. Marcus Vega was looking at me. His expression was not what I expected. It was not relief or gratitude or anger. He looked thoughtful, like he was watching something and filing it away. "Iran 4, he said. "Yes," I said. "I appreciate that," he said. "I mean that genuinely." "I know," I said. He looked back at Vorathdal. "I'm going to go," he said. He was already picking up his notebook. "Not because of the sounds," he stood. "Because of the third one, not because it would break me." He met the Kethani's eyes directly. "Because you brought it, and I want you to think about what that says about this session and about you." He was at the door. He stopped, turned back. "You wanted to see if I'd react differently without the professor and the biosensors," he said. "The answer is no. The setting doesn't change it." "That's not how it works." He looked at Vorathdal with something that was not hostility. It was more like sorrow, maybe. "Whatever you were hoping to find, I'm sorry I don't have it for you." And he left. I submitted the incident report to the Academic Review Board that evening. It took 12 minutes. I made sure my language was precise. Vorathdal received a formal reprimand and mandatory additional coursework in interspecies ethics. 2 of the other 6 received counseling sessions. The study session booking was flagged in the system. None of that is the part of that day that matters most to me, looking back. What matters most is what Marcus said as he walked out. "Whatever you were hoping to find, I'm sorry I don't have it for you." That evening, I was sitting in the common terrace near the Third Sun viewing platform, finishing my observation notes for the day, when Marcus found me. He sat down on the bench adjacent to mine. He had his thermos back. He sipped from it and looked at the third sun, which was setting in a very particular shade of deep orange that the Sector 9 atmosphere produced and that I had always found beautiful. "You've been observing me since day 1, he said. "That is my job," I said. "I know," he said. "I'm not complaining," he paused. "Can I ask what you're observing for?" "General behavioral record," I said. "The first human in session 14. It is academically notable." "Right," he sipped his thermos. "Can I ask what you've found?" I considered the question carefully. "I have found," I said, that my initial assumptions about what I would be observing were incorrect. He looked at me. I expected to observe adaptation, I said. A young species representative learning to navigate an environment built for more established civilizations, learning the cues, the protocols, the appropriate ways to respond. I paused. I have not observed that. I have observed something that functions differently. What is it? He asked. I thought about how to say it in a way that would translate. You are not adapting to the environment, I said. You are including it. You are taking in the information about where you are and what is here and adding it to a collection that already exists. You are not becoming a different thing in a new place. You are being the same thing in a new place, and the same thing is larger than the new place expected. Marcus was quiet for a long time. That's a very kind way to say it, he said finally. It is not kindness, I said. It is observation. He looked at the third sun setting. Iran 4, he said. Have you ever been to a place that was genuinely trying to kill you? Not the Academy version, not evolutionary threat sounds in a classroom, an actual place where the environment was actively and specifically hostile to your existence. No, I said. I haven't either, he said. Not the way people think, but I've been to the edges of places like that. The property backs up against some real wilderness. We've had bad weather systems. We've had things happen. He paused. And the thing I found was that those places are not hostile in a personal way. They're not doing it at you. They're just doing what they do. And once you understand that, it stops feeling like an attack and starts feeling like weather. Something to be aware of, something to be ready for, not something to be afraid of in a way that stops you from moving. Humans have a very specific relationship to hostile environments, I said. We live in one, he said. We've always lived in one. Earth is beautiful and Earth is brutal, and those two things are completely simultaneous and always have been. He turned the thermos in his hands. You can't grow up there without understanding that the beautiful thing can turn on you, and it's not because it chose to. It's just because that's what it is. And you love it anyway. You love it more, maybe, because you know what it is. We were quiet together for a while, watching the third sun finish its descent. Why did you come to the Academy? I asked. To understand things, he said. To add to the collection. What collection? He thought about it. Of what other people are, he said. Of what it means to be one thing in a universe full of completely different things. Of what we all are when you get past the fear sounds and the evolutionary data and the assumption that everyone operates on the same framework. He paused. My grandmother always said the best thing a person can do is go far enough from home that home starts to make sense in a new way, and then go home. You are planning to go home, I said. Eventually, he said. Yeah. And what will you bring back? He smiled. It was the same private, genuine smile from session 14. The collection, he said. The next morning, I added a new section to my observation log. I titled it, On the Relationship Between Environmental Hostility and Experiential Expansion in Homo sapiens. I wrote for 3 hours. It was the best writing I had done in 6 cycles. I submitted it to the academic review board alongside my session notes, and I flagged it for Professor Aldon Six's attention. Within a week, Aldon Six had scheduled a follow-up interview with Marcus. Within a month, the Xenobiology Fear database had a new supplementary section, co-authored by Aldon Six, the Xenobiology team, and listed as contributing consultant practical application framework, Cadet Marcus Vega, Sector 9 Integration Academy, Session 14. It is not the most famous academic contribution in the Academy's history, but it might be the most honest. On Marcus Vega's last evening of his first semester, before he went back to Earth for the intersemester break, I found him on the common terrace again. This time he was not alone. Sarath Ven was there, and 2 of the Shorin cadets, and the Pelari cadet, whose name I had finally learned was something that translated roughly to Stone Who Has Held, and who had become, in the weeks since Session 14, one of Marcus's most consistent dining companions. They were talking about something that was making all of them laugh. I did not catch what. I did not need to. I stood at the edge of the terrace and watched a room, well, a terrace, but the feeling of a room full of wildly different beings, all leaning toward each other, all in the active process of adding to their collections. Marcus looked up and saw me. He raised his thermos. I raised my tablet, which was the closest I had to an equivalent gesture. He grinned. The third sun was rising again. Different angle, different shade. Same fire. The last line I wrote in my observation log, that semester, was not a clinical notation. It was something I put at the bottom of the page and underlined twice. I wrote, "The sounds your enemy plays at you are only as powerful as your ignorance of what they are. The moment you recognize them, truly recognize them, name them, sit with them, understand their edges and their limits and their distance from meaning, they become information. And information is not what stops you. Information is what moves you forward." End of semester log, Cadet Observer Iran 4, Velhari Collective. P.S. The coffee is not good. It is, as the human said, complicated. I have now had it 4 times. I will have it again tomorrow. I think I am beginning to understand what he meant.